Hello everyone, this is Mr. Seymour, and this lesson is on the Neolithic Revolution. Today we're going to learn about the transformation from a hunting-gathering society to one involving agriculture. So at the end of this section you will be able to identify major causes and describe the major effects of the following events from 8000 BC to 500 BC, and that is the development of agriculture. The term Neolithic Revolution was coined in 1923 by V. Gordon Childe to describe the first in a series of agricultural revolutions that started in the Middle East somewhere around 8000 BCE. But we can also see these in civilizations all over the globe. This period then is described as a revolution not because it occurred very quickly, but because of its importance, its magnitude, and because of the great significance and degree of change that affected the communities where these new agricultural practices would be gradually adopted and refined. This is a gradual process of change, not something that happens overnight or within a few days or a few weeks or a few months or a few years, thousands of years. The beginning of the process dates back to different regions, anywhere from 10,000 to 8,000 BC in the Fertile Crescent, and perhaps 8,000 BC in Melanesia, in about 2500 BC in the sub-Saharan areas of Africa. And some consider the developments anywhere from 9000 to 7000 BC in the Fertile Crescent to be the most important, and we'll look at the Fertile Crescent next. Now, this transition everywhere seems associated with a change from something that's nomadic hunters and gatherers, where people are moving from place to place and searching for food, to a more settled or sedentary life. It's an agrarian-based life with the inception of the domestication of various plants and animals. People are growing food and they're raising animals for the purposes of food or other byproducts like their hides. It depends on the species that are locally available, and it was probably also influenced by culture. Now, recently, archaeological research suggests that in some regions, like in Southeast Asia, the transitions from hunter-gatherers to agriculture was not something that happened in a straight line, but something that happened and stopped and then happened and then stopped. The Fertile Crescent, though, is the most important of our civilizations when it comes to the growth or birth of agriculture. This is an area between the Tigris and the Euphrates rivers in modern-day Iraq that is given the term because it's a crescent-shaped geographical form. It's believed to be the origin of agricultural development, but it's also one of at least 5 similar regions around the world that would see independent development of agriculture. Major developments of the Neolithic Revolution start with hunting and gathering societies, which lead to the discovery of agriculture, which lead to a shift from moving around to staying in one place. That's nomadic to sedentary. And then new tools are found to grow more crops, like the plow and the hoe. Food surpluses are the result. You're growing more food than you can consume, so what do? You trade it. This brings people together in villages, and then this allows for small-scale trade. But as those villages grow and grow, the growth of cities come together for large-scale trade. And then the growth of cities lead to the rise of civilizations. So it is a process. Now, what is a civilization? A civilization is a complex society that meets some specific characteristics. And the first of those is complex institutions. So this is number 1. Complex institutions. These include having formal governments with officials and laws, the rise of religion that include both that have priests and religious and political power, a system of education for government workers, and then scribes, people who are recording information for the government. Specialized workers, like those scribes, then are the second thing we look for. This is number 2. Make it better, 2 here. This is number 2. Specialized workers. This includes merchants, soldiers, priests, potters, people who make pottery, jugs and vases and things like that, scribes who write things down, teachers, people who work with metal, government officials, farmers, and weavers, people who make cloth. Just to name a few of the specialized workers that we will have. And the third thing is you have to have a system of record keeping. A system of record keeping means you recording things. Now, it doesn't mean writing as we know it necessarily, but it is the rise of written records. And the first ones are going to be on clay tablets that we call cuneiform, and we'll talk about that in the next lesson. So clay tablets, which record business transactions. I trade 3 pigs for a cow. Historic events, customs, traditions, even pieces of literature. The first recorded piece of literature on clay tablets is Sumerian, and it's called the Epic of Gilgamesh. Then we have advanced technologies, things like the wheel, the plow, a sailboat, bronze weapons, body armor. Not every civilization will develop the same technologies, and they're not all going to appear at the same time. Often, technology will spread from one place to another through a process called cultural diffusion and through trade, particularly through trade. Then that's number 4, advanced technologies. And number 5 is advanced cities. A city is defined as a large center of regional trade. For example, in Samaria, you had the cities of Uruk, Lagash, and Umma, but others will appear all over the world. So what's so important about civilizations? Well, first, they're organized in densely populated settlements, meaning a lot of people are coming together. And in those settlements, they're divided into what we call hierarchical social classes. And that means that you have people who are rich and people who are poor, a ruling elite, and a subordinate group of people who are living either in the city or out in the country who are working. And these people are engaging in intensive agriculture, mining, small-scale manufacturing, making things and selling things, and trade. And then civilization concentrates power that extends human control over our environment. So humans become an extension of our environment. We start to want to make changes to our environment. If we don't have water going to the crops, we bring the water to the crops. For instance, if we don't have food, we grow our food. We don't just hunt for our food. These are changes that are very important that lead to civilization. So culture. Human beings have had several important advantages over other animals. And one of them is our intense intellect, the use of our brains. Plus we have the use of our hands to make tools and the ability to communicate through speech. Because human beings have these ways of communicating and remembering and making things, they're also able to pass on what they have learned to other people and to other civilizations. And by doing that, we form a culture. In this way, the first human cultures will develop. And culture, for our purposes, will be defined as a people's way of life. And that includes religious practices, traditions, customs, the way we dress, our patterns of trade, and even the food that we eat. When a practice or a cultural tradition begins in a specific place or a specific civilization, then we often refer to that civilization or that place as being a cultural hearth. So for instance, we're going to look at the Fertile Crescent as being the cultural hearth of agriculture. Now, the earliest cultural hearths share one geographic feature in common. They all appear in river valleys, which we'll talk about in the next lesson. Why river valleys? I want you to think about that between now and the next lesson. Why river valleys? It's a very important trait that all of these civilizations have in common. So this is major hearths of agriculture, places where agriculture developed. And you can see that it's global, all over the world except for maybe the North Pole and the South Pole. And these are our ancient river valley civilizations. We have in Africa, the Nile. We have in the Middle East, the Tigris-Euphrates Valley, which today is Iraq. We have in India, the Ganges and the Indus rivers. And we have in China, the Yellow River and the Yangtze River. And all of these are river valley civilizations. So what have we learned so far? Well, we've learned that the shift from hunting and gathering to the gradual use of agriculture and the domestication of animals is called the Neolithic Revolution. Next, we've learned that this shift to agriculture is called a revolution because of its impact, because of not the speed at which it happened, but how much change it ultimately caused. This is a tremendous impact on the history of mankind. It's incredibly important. But the revolution also takes a great deal of time, thousands of years, to take shape. And it doesn't happen simultaneously, but at the same time, it happens independently in at least 4 or 5 different what we call hearths all over the globe. And early agricultural societies have one thing in common. They all tend to develop in major river valleys, with the Fertile Crescent in Iraq being the earliest. Now, the development and the use of agricultural technology, as basic as it was, we're not talking tractors and trailers here. We're talking things like just using a plow or a digging stick or a hoe to put and organize our crops, leads to what we call sedentary societies. And the sedentary society means you stay in one place. So these sedentary societies are able to grow food surpluses, which are more food than they need. And so when that happens, they come together to trade those surpluses for the goods and services that they need. And then trade will lead to even larger cultures, which eventually become civilizations and the growth of cities. And these civilizations have traits: complex governments and religious institutions, the use of record keeping, the employment of specialized workers, the growth of cities, which act as centers of trade, and then the use of complex technologies. And our idea of a complex technology and their idea of a complex technology are very, very, very different. And that ends at least an introduction into the Neolithic Revolution.